There's a great tragic irony in fantasy fiction, in that writers love prologues and readers hate them. If you have any experience with free fiction hosting sites like Royal Road, Wattpad, or AO3, you know that generally there are significantly higher views on your first chapters than on your prologues in the same story. The problem with prologues is that, by definition, they are not part of the story. They are prologos, before words. Sometimes a prologue is disguised as a chapter 1, but the label itself is a warning sign telling the reader, you don't have to read this part because the story actually begins in a few pages. Especially in the realm of unpublished fantasy manuscripts, you often see the prologue serve as a garbage dump of world building. You often see thousands of words of textbook language describing how the Dark Lord and his army of noblins fought the noble Nelves before a chosen one with a magic sword put him to sleep for 1,000 years. And then the kingdoms of men had a bunch of wars between themselves, but maybe someday the Dark Lord will return and someone will have to find a magic sword again. You know, as you do. And for all I know, that stuff could lead into an amazing story. It could precede a great book. Unfortunately, there are about 1 billion great books out there today. I believe we no longer live in an age when the fantasy genre is small and filled mostly with pulp, but that more valuable, redeemable fiction exists today than a reasonable person could read in a lifetime as a casual hobby. I'd love to go on a rant about self-publishing and the sheer volume of things published on Kindle each day, and how book ratings on Amazon are worthless, but that's a topic for another time. For now, I just ask you to work with me on the premise that you cannot reasonably expect a potential reader to just trust your book is good for 10 or 25% of its length until the good stuff happens. These days we require a story to grab us by the heel and not let go until we're done bludgeoning it with our time and money. So, rolling back around to the profusion of fantasy prologues that set up history and world building without actually involving the story, I've got very little to base this on, but I feel it likely that aspiring fantasy writers for years have been inspired by the prologue not to a book, but to the Peter Jackson adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring. I've spent a long time deciding how well I think this works, and I came to the conclusion I feel it does its job well, far better than most of its imitators, if my previous hypothesis is at all correct. And also, by the way, we're going to have a look at the prologue to A Game of Thrones, the book this time, and why I feel Martin did at least that very first prologue of the first book well. Back to Tolkien first. A surprising number of people who love fantasy in general haven't actually read The Lord of the Rings. It's dense and often boring, I get it, but I found there's popular belief that Fellowship the book begins the same way as Fellowship the movie. In fact, the book begins with a terrible prologue, one employing a framing device that serves mostly to dump world building for a culture we spend relatively little time in, as well as creating a tone we don't really carry with us for the majority of the story. I won't read the whole nearly 10,000 word prologue, but we're going to take a short look at some bits from it. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Spoiler, it's a lot of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published, under the title of The Hobbit. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Those days, the Third Age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed, but the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the Old World, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books, and even gathered reports of old times and distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they called it, away north of the Shire. But there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king. For they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is probable that Meriadoc obtained assistance and information from Rivendell, which he visited more than once. There, though Elrond had departed, his sons long remained, together with some of the high elven folk. It is said that Celeborn went to dwell there after the departure of Galadriel, but there is no record of the day when at last he sought the Grey Havens, and with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. Well, a bit of a slog for a modern audience. Granted, Tolkien has the benefit of history. The Lord of the Rings would likely be impossible to publish today, but that's not a thing Tolkien needs to worry about, nor are we modern readers his primary audience. However, Jackson in his 2001 film was dealing with a different sort of audience, who is admittedly not the sort of audience he would be needing to please nearly 20 years later today. Ugh, time has flown. But I think he did the best he could given the circumstances. Jackson strips out much of the later described lore and transcribes it briefly at the beginning, and as he's filmmaking, his prologue can't be skipped over by a theater-going audience, and they're not at risk of leaving their seats because the first few lines of the work didn't grab them, as would be. So let's look briefly at some important bits from that film prologue. After some great opening tone, which is the forte of a medium combining visuals and audio as well as narrative, we are introduced to the original ring bearers. We see 3 elves with rings, the most prominent in the frame at least, of whom is our narrator Galadriel, setting strong precedent for her later mystical appearance in the film. The 9 kings get special emphasis, since they serve as primary antagonal forces later. And we see the power of Sauron, the big bad, as he smacks some dude around a little. And we get our thematic seed, that the ring corrupts even heroes like brave Isildur, which is echoed with Boromir's death at the end of the movie, not to mention the climax of the whole series. Having been given some action, pretty visuals, and setup of later important characters, we can now jump into the Shire without feeling promised that the whole story will take place in the idyllic little town. And, it works. In its medium, it really does. But in a novel, readers clamor, often, usually generally, don't quote me on this, that character matters above all else, and even a written prologue with similar strengths to Jackson's prologue can miss that character angle that is so necessary. So let's turn now to a fantasy novel prologue that I do believe works well. The prologue to A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. We're not going to read the whole thing here, it's pretty long, we've already been going for a bit, but I will link in the description to the Amazon page for A Game of Thrones where you can read the whole text of the prologue for free. We're just going to look at a few small bits from here. Right away, we get our conflicted conversation between 2 characters, a moody setting description in just a few words, the woods beginning to grow dark around them, and we have a line of foreshadowing not only the antagonists of this prologue, but of the overarching story for at least one of the main characters. Do the dead frighten you? The succeeding paragraphs develop this striking opening, giving us a connection to Will and Garrett. We get further repetition of the theme of ice versus fire, and the Night's Watch at the front lines of that, as the men discuss whether some men were killed by the cold. Down here somewhere. Yes, everyone talks about snows, 40 foot deep, how the ice wind comes howling out of the north, but the real enemy is the cold. Nothing burns like the cold. Wonderful. The final paragraphs of the prologue give a visual description of the horrific enemy of the others, and create a sense of hopelessness for our characters. A shadow emerged from the dark of the wood. It stood in front of Royce. Tall it was, and gaunt, and hard as old bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armor seemed to change color as it moved. Here it was white as new-fallen snow, there black as shadow, everywhere dappled with the deep gray-green of the trees. The patterns ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. Will heard the breath go out of Sir Waymar Royce in a long hiss. "Come no farther," the lordling warned. His voice cracked like a boy's. He threw the long sable cloak back over his shoulders to free his arms for battle, and took his sword in both hands. The wind had stopped. It was very cold. We then find out, in the first chapter immediately following this, that the sole survivor of the prologue is executed as a deserter. You don't need to read the prologue to begin the story at chapter 1, but if you do, you're rewarded with some great atmosphere and the first instance of the themes driving A Song of Ice and Fire, that winter is coming and cannot be stopped, that all men must die, and that young pompous fools have no place in the world. So I believe if you're to have a prologue in a book that you expect will hook people in, this is a good way to go about it. Reward your reader for reading rather than punishing them for skipping. Prologues are something I struggle with myself. On one hand, I know how boring they can be. I know that's the expectation of them. I skip most prologues I find, especially in fantasy books. On the other hand, they're a great opportunity for framing the coming story, if they're executed well. In a current work in progress, a prologue involves an ex-Nazi scientist and a band of Allied special agents finding a German U-boat having crashed into the Himalayas and filled with vibrant orchids. I'm betting on it being a short, striking, bizarre scene that will hook the reader right in if they read it, but occurs so separate to the opening of the story proper that later flashbacks and description will allow a reader to skip that same prologue if they feel like it, and not be punished. How about you? Do you enjoy prologues? Do you read them at all? If you have a work in progress with a prologue, what measures are you taking to ensure it helps your story rather than hurting it? Thank you for watching. Let me know in a comment these things below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe and bell icons. I will see you next week.